At this time, I want to introduce our illustrious guest speaker. Kerr Mesner has been my ministry partner over this summer period, and even beforehand, we've partnered together, but we're getting to do so in a new way. I'm so grateful. Last time Kerr preached, I didn't introduce him because, again, he belongs to us and we belong to him. But I realized that there are people who haven't met Kerr or are less familiar, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about his work before he brings us the message. Kerr Mesner is a consultant, facilitator, and spiritual director, as well as a queer, transgender, contemplative Christian artist and activist. Through his company, Heart Story Consulting, he supports schools, higher education institutions, and nonprofits in creating spaces that honor diversity with a particular focus on the work of celebrating gender diversity. He is trained with the Pacific Jubilee Program in Spiritual Direction and is an ordained minister in the Metropolitan Community Churches. In his spare time, he enjoys writing songs and playing in his garden. We are so honored that Kerr is part of us, and we are so excited to hear what he has to say today. Passing it to you, friend.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. It is such a joy to be here with all of you today. Can you just give me a thumbs up on Zoom if the sound is okay? And in the sanctuary, if there's an issue, then someone please jump up and shout. Great. Like many of you, I've got multiple fans going right now, and I wanted to make sure they weren't interfering with your ability to hear me. So good morning, friends. It is just such a joy to be here with you again this morning. I've been thinking a lot this week about the ways that we get to spend time in community, even across geography, and feeling a special gratitude today for our friends who join us online as well, and for our small and mighty online group of volunteers like Jack and Becky who show up so consistently and faithfully to help us host worship. I'm delighted to get to spend some time with you this morning reflecting on God's word. Before we move into our readings for today, I want to invite you one more time to really arrive, to take a moment right now and to breathe, to perhaps feel your feet on the floor if your feet have contact with the floor, to feel the surface on which you're sitting, and just to gently bring a light attention to your breath. Nothing you need to change, nothing you need to fix, just noticing with kindness and curiosity. And so having arrived, let's move to today's readings. Our first reading today is actually a video presented by Alok Vaid Menon. Alok is a non-binary, trans-feminine performing artist, writer, and public speaker whose work has reached international audiences. Side note, as Priscilla mentioned last week, Non-Binary Celebration Day was last Sunday. The video we're watching today is one where Alok speaks on disrupting the gender binary, trans survival, and trans beauty and brilliance. Let's have a look. Faith is going to share this with us now.
I often say that what I'm most proud of is the fact that I exist. I think time and time again, I'm told that I am not real. I'm told that there's only two genders. I'm told that in order to be beautiful, you have to look like a man or a woman. I'm told that I'm too much, too excessive, too flamboyant, too weird. And all of that, I just sort of shrug and keep on going. And so I think every single day for many of us as trans people, the fact that we exist despite the constant persecution that we experience is an act of triumph. I'm a performance artist, which means I basically run across the world crying on stages and get paid for it, which is really awesome. A lot of what my art is about the issues facing trans and gender nonconforming people. So what many people don't actually recognize is that even with so many recent victories for LGBT people, trans and gender nonconforming people are still experiencing a lot of violence and persecution. So I use my art as a way to sort of draw attention to some of the issues that I face navigating harassment on the daily as a gender nonconforming person, but then also to tell my own story of triumph and resilience amidst all of that violence. Time and time again, they're going to tell us that we're powerless, and they're going to tell us that we're insignificant, but that's precisely because we have power. The reason that we experience so much discrimination and persecution is because people are threatened by the ways in which we have found ourselves and found and are fighting for justice and truth in our own identities. I think for me, Pride isn't just about a day or a month, it's a lifestyle. It's every single day of my life, taking all the shame that's sent in my direction and actually finding myself to be proud in all the things that I've been told to be ashamed of. So whether that looks like what I look like or my politics or where I'm from, it's about actually recognizing that so often what we're dealing with is not our own issues as an LGBTQ community, it's the shame that straight and cis people put on us. It's really important every Pride season to remember that Pride was started for and by trans and gender nonconforming people of color, and that it's actually us who continue to experience the brunt of homophobia and transphobia. So I think that we still have to push forward with Pride to make sure that trans people are elevated to the platform that we deserve. I think what I'm fighting for is a world where we actually respect people for people, not for the gender binary. And I think we have a long way to go where so many of the freedoms and equal measures that we have as a community are contingent on us looking like men or women. But when we're gender nonconforming, we're often lost or erased. So I think what my legacy is to recognize that gender nonconformity is not just a phase, it's not just an in-between, it's valid unto itself.
Thank you so much, Faith. Always grateful when we can bring these other voices into our space. Let's just take a breath right now to receive all of that. And now our second reading is a very simple one. We are returning back to the Gospel of John, where we were last week as well with Reverend Retta. And in this reading, just prior to this reading, which is going to be a very familiar excerpt to you, I think, just prior to this reading, Jesus is having a meal, his final meal with his disciples, and he washes his disciples' feet. And then he has a really frank conversation with them about his impending betrayal. And he sends Judas on his way to enact that betrayal. And shortly after that, he makes this statement that has become a deep touchstone for the Christian faith. This is John 13:34-35, and sometimes called the Great Commandment. I give you a new commandment, love one another, and you're to love one another the way I have loved you. This is how all will know that you're my disciples, that you truly love one another. Let's take a breath to receive this as well. You might remember that we did indeed spend time with John last week with Reverend Retta. She reminded us of Jesus's love in and for us. And I apologize. I think my cat has decided to co-preach with me this morning, so you may hear her voice. Reverend Retta spoke with us about the collective work of heartbreak, of holding space for each other. I want to suggest that this kind of work in community is embodied work. It's work that requires us to breathe, to be in our bodies, to feel. It's work that requires us to be present with and in ourselves. As our opening sentences invited us today, to appreciate the gifts of who we are as individuals, and from that place to enter into the work of community and of solidarity. I really want to bring our attention to this simple, humble, embodied act of Jesus washing his friends' feet. There's something so embodied about this moment. They're speaking together about an impending grief, a community heartbreak. And for me, there's just something so vulnerable and grounding in this act of touching a beloved's feet. When I preached with you 2 weeks ago, we talked about finding a connection with our bodies. If you weren't here, or just to remind you, the idea is simply to find a physical point of connection with your body. It could be a hand on your belly. It might be as simple as one hand clasping the other. It might be your feet on the floor. For me, it's often a hand on my chest, or a hand on my chest and a hand on my belly. I invite you to find that point of connection once again today. I invite us to be in our bodies today, just as much or as little as feels okay for each one of us. Because of course, for some of us who have experienced bodily trauma, being in our bodies is a big ask. So I invite you to go really gently with this practice. It might be enough simply to bring a gentle attention to your breath as it goes in and out. I invite us to be in our bodies as we explore this work of community, as we consider Jesus's words, where he says, I give you a new commandment, love one another, and you're to love one another the way that I have loved you. This is how all will know that you're my disciples, that you truly love one another. I want to suggest that ours is the work of showing up in solidarity for one another, of really paying attention to what is happening in our world and how that might impact those with whom we share community. Let me give you an example, and it connects back to our first reading with Alok this morning. I actually told some of this story in the most recent issue of G's magazine that's just come out, and I want to give a shout out to them for the opportunity to tell the story there. I was recently delighting in the process of settling into my new office space, and I was looking out my big windows onto a beautiful view of trees and green. And I was appreciating that across the street from me, I could see a view of a church. After some time, I was curious to learn more about this particular church. I knew nothing about it. So I looked them up online. And as I almost always do, I went quickly to their statement of faith. That's usually one of my first starting points when I'm checking out a church. Their theological statement was one of the most virulently homophobic and transphobic ones that I've read in years. I'm clear, of course, as a queer trans minister, that this is nonsense. It's sloppy theology, and many preachers have unpacked that theology, including in this community. If this is new territory to you, I encourage you to check out Shannon Kieran's new book, In the Margins. Shannon is the trans minister that preached here a few months ago. And his book just came out, and it's a delight. It's a wonderful way to get a good bite of trans and queer theology in a really accessible way. At any rate, the theology that I saw on this church's website doesn't just stop with this church. This bad theology, I'm being frank with you today, this bad theology underpins much of the anti-trans violence that is rampant in the US. It underpins the wave of legislations sweeping the US right now, targeting trans folks. Some of you know that I work now as a consultant, and Priscilla mentioned that in the intro. I'd say that the biggest part of my work these days is training folks on how to create spaces that support and celebrate trans, non-binary, and gender diverse folks. As I completed another training for a group this week, I realized that my work is probably going to get harder and more complicated now because of these laws moving through about 20 of our more conservative states. Did you know that this year, in the first half or so of this year, there have been at least 162 anti-LGBTQ laws introduced? Did you know that most of those laws target trans folks, and that many of those laws target trans youth, denying them life-saving medical care, equitable access to education, athletics, and more? Kip spoke with us about this a couple of months ago as well, when he spoke of a law where Texas tried to equate supporting trans children with child abuse. It's a lot. For those of us who live in trans, non-binary, gender-expansive bodies, it's a lot. The Trevor Project recently released a report demonstrating a direct link between anti-LGBTQ laws and queer youth mental health. And for sure, for those of us who love trans, non-binary, gender-expansive people in our lives, it's a lot. And yet, And yet, back to my story. As I reflected on what it means to me that my office looks directly out onto this church building that helps perpetuate, yes, that's the word I was looking for, perpetuate anti-LGBTQ theology, I also remembered that on the wall behind me in this same office is a print, an icon of Sylvia Rivera created by artist Jen Castleberry. Sylvia, one of the earliest instigators of trans and LGBTQ rebellion, was my friend during my time in New York City. And among other adventures, we were arrested together, protesting Christian homophobia in the Catholic Church. I found myself thinking about Sylvia and about this church across the street, about my trans siblings who are struggling, who are surviving, who are thriving, who are brilliant. And reflecting on all of this, I wrote a song. It's called Got Your Back, also the title of our sermon today. It's a simple song, a very simple song, almost a chant of resistance, of solidarity, and of God's love for trans folks. I think of it as a sung prayer with and to trans bodies. I imagine it as being sung with a group of trans and non-binary singers, maybe at a protest or a rally. I can actually visualize the scene where each sibling steps up and adds in their lines to the song. The first sibling stepping forward, singing the line, "I'm here, I've got your back." And the second person joining them, singing that same line in harmony. A third sibling joins in, reminding us of the steely backbone we need to have to survive and thrive in this world by singing the line, "Keep your spine strong." A fourth sibling joins in, reminding us to breathe, to breathe, to breathe, singing the line, "Breathe in, breathe out." And then finally, the last voice is what I imagine to be the voice of God joining in, and God's voice is clear, unequivocal, saying enough. God sings, "Feel my heart beating in you, beating strong. No more bodies on the line. My line is drawn." And so as I wrote and sang this song, I knew that Sylvia Ray Rivera has my back. I knew that God has my back, and I know that God has the backs of my trans, non-binary, and gender expansive siblings. I want to share this song with you for right now. For the time being, all the voices that you'll hear are my own, but I do hope at one point to record it with a group of trans and non-binary singers. Let's have a listen. Bear with me one moment while I pull it up. This is Got Your Back.
Here, I've got your back. I'm here, I've got your back. I'm here, I've got your back. I'm here, I've got your back. Keep your spine, 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 I've got your back.
Feel my heart beating in you, beating strong. No more bodies on the line, my line is drawn. Feel my heart beating in you, beating strong. No more bodies on the line, my line is drawn. Feel my heart beating in you, beating strong. No more bodies on the line, my line is drawn. Feel my heart beating in you, beating strong. No more bodies on the line, my line is drawn. Thank you, friends. I've been speaking a lot today about solidarity with trans and non-binary folks, partly because they are facing such an onslaught of legislative violence right now. and partly because I can speak authentically from my own embodied experience as a trans man myself. But my point today is also that our work of solidarity asks us to listen closely to our many communities within this community of Chestnut Hill United Church. Who might be carrying a particularly heavy portion of the weight of the world right now? Which of our beloveds here in this church community are being most impacted by the headlines we're reading day to day? How might we have each other's backs? How might I and you have one another's backs as we combat racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, sexism, ageism, and more? This is hard work. It's good work. It's embodied work. And so once again, I invite you to find that point of connection with your body. A hand on the chest or the belly, two hands clasped together, feet on the floor, or simply a gentle attention to your breath itself. Find that connection. Breathe in, breathe out. And from this place of embodied connection, I invite you to hold this possibility of having one another's backs. How might this possibility land for you today? Do you need to ask a friend or a beloved to have your back? Or do you want to ask a friend or a beloved how you might be able to have their back? I invite you to hold that question in the week ahead, to sit with it, to breathe with it, and to see where it takes you. If you feel so led, I'd also like to invite you to email me a sentence in the coming week or two, letting me know what it's meaning to you right now to have one another's backs. I'll send out a reminder through the church email this coming week, inviting your responses. And I invite you to, and I'll include my email address when I do that. And I invite you to send me your responses and your thoughts over the next 2 or 3 weeks. When I preach with you again at the end of August, I want to reflect on what you've shared as a part of that sermon. When I wrote this song with Sylvia's picture behind me in my office, I knew that as I sang it, Sylvia had my back. I knew and I know that God has my back. And I know that God has your back too. This is God's good news. Amen.